We're beginning the second part of the discussions, lectures, by the lecture of Tomáš Petráček. He's a Catholic priest, historian, and theologian. He's working in Hradec Králové. He's lecturing history at the Catholic Faculty of Theology at the Charles University in Prague, at the Pedagogical Faculty of Hradec Králové, where he's at the same time a head of the of cultural and religious studies. He's interested in modern history of Catholic Church, secularization processes, and relationships between the Church and the state. Among his publications, there are Bible and Modern Criticism, The Church, Tradition and Reform, and the book The East and Their Belief. Here you go, Tomáš. It's up to you. Thank you very much for welcoming me. I apologize for this online form. I hope it won't be any problem for you. I was asked to offer to this conference a historical perspective, and at the end, after some consideration, I decided, instead of offering an overview discussion or a lecture, medieval times and synodality, it's very important and it has many forms and facets. So instead of that, let me focus on 3 points into 3 specific attempts at synodal approach, especially in the Czech Catholic Church. In the first case, we're talking about the regional Prague Synod from 1860. The second one, Synod at the turn of the 20th century. And the third one, the youngest part of the mosaic at the attempt of synodal, the plenary council of the Czech Catholic Church, which started in 1996 and it was ended finished in 2005. I won't lose any more time by giving you definitions of pastoral aspects of synodality. It's already been discussed by my predecessors. I just like to give you a slight introduction. There is absence of fixed form of the organization of the church. On the other hand, the pages of the New Testament are all about the openness of the church service, the seriousness, the way of articulating its teaching. A new complex and global society is being formed. Some of the solutions are inefficient, some even unacceptable. With some of those statements, it's possible to disagree, especially in the post-communist European countries in interchurch debates. Church isn't supposed to be a democracy. As we can see in the ancient history, even the modern history, it's not that easy. And we need to be careful with these statements. We need to ask ourselves a question, what really is endangered and what it really means. Let's have a look at the Prague Provincial Synod from 1860. It's something convened by the Archbishop as the Convention of the Bishops of local province. The Fourth Lateran Council The synods were supposed to take place annually, which wasn't always possible. Where the reformators, just like Jan Hus, they tried to name the actual devices, and they came up with suggestions for improvements.
The Middle Age period, there was a difficult part where the papacy was not really in favor of this. The provincial synods should have taken place every 3 years, but it was really happening only in the first decade, where the new disciplinary decrees were put into practice. The first provincial synod in the Czech Republic was organized in 1605 by Archbishop Zbigniew, and then organizing the synods in the 17th and 18th century was not really happening, despite the attempts to organize them in Tuscany and Germany at the end of 18th century. They again appeared around 1848 in Belgium, France, Spain, and the United States. For those bishop synods, all bishops, vicar generals, all the parish priests, all the canons and representatives of religious orders were supposed to come. To provincial synods, only bishops and vicar generals, abbots, provosts, provincial order representatives, and experts, including experienced parish priests and professors, were invited. Already at the revolution of 1848, part of Catholic priests was discussing the inner church democracy and enforcing the role of priestly gatherings. The Prague Provincial Synod was called on the 15th of June 1860 by Prague Archbishop Schwarzenberg after being approved by the Holy See. These synods usually didn't take long. The Prague Synod took from the 8th to the 23rd of September 1860. It was taking place either in specialized committees, either in general congregations in the Seminarian Church of St. Salvador. No women were representative, no lay people were represented, and it was happening behind a closed door. Everybody was bound to silence until the decrees were approved by Rome, and then they could be published. The Prague Synod wasn't first in monarchy. Before this one, there was a provincial synod in Vienna and Esztergom. Church in Austria could organize it due to freedom, which it gained in 1850, and thanks to being corresponding to the Roman concept of pastoral and disciplinary renewal of the church. There were some more diocesan synods in Prague, in Hradec Králové and Litoměřice, and then 3 in České Budějovice. Later in the 1870s, there was
Decline.
There was a break because of the decreasing political situation, and also because some of the questions were already solved. The role of the provincial and diocesan synod was to make an inventory of the current situation of the local church, to find the regions of its life which needed to be changed or developed, and also to suggest some
solutions. Its statutes were legally stipulating for the entire church provision. There was another interest, a symbolic one, because it gave a manual to vicars. There are so many other elements in the questions of church governance, and also the fortune of the church. There is a pastoral renewal of the church provinces. We should encourage God worship. A typical church reform, a Catholic church reform. Remodels. Most elaborate chapters. They should be ideal in this one. The priests, they are given higher education. They're publishing. They gain advantage because should be a career ladder based on experiences, teaching, and experiences and education. For the style that the church is coming to terms with the world, the second chapter is especially important about the Catholic teaching, the most important errors of its time. It talks about the hatred of the world towards the church. The world is doing its best to form obstacles in the way of the church. And it enables people, it disables people from discovering the truth. The church is a perfect communion given by God to the popes and bishops, and the state shouldn't really intervene in it. It is necessary for this church state to exist, and it's necessary for the Pope to be able to complete or fulfill its mission in the church. This is what all the Catholics need to bear in mind. Those who are against the official authority are also against the God.
There was a very special part on cemeteries and also on the form of churches, which were exactly following the dispositions of this synod. The second model is very special. I would call it the synodal elements in the meetings of the country union of the Czech Catholic priesthood. At the end of the 19th century, there was a very highly intellectual Catholic church in the Czech Republic or Czech lands, and they called themselves Czech Catholic modern style, which was originally a specific phenomenon of the cultural and art renewal of the Catholic Church in the Czech land. The second important stream was a Christian and social movement, which was very fast developing in the 90s of the 19th century in the effort of politically organize the Catholic population and mobilize it to defend the Christian values and positions of the Catholic Church in the community, in the society. From the beginning, there were many different elements and many different streams in it, and until 1918, it didn't transform into a really effective political power, but then it played its role in gathering the engaged priests and lay people whose ambitions was reform of the society and also all the institutions, including the Catholic Church. From 1892, the movement of the Catholic modern style was organized on the Prague Synod in August 1897, where about 150 participants were gathered. There were literary and artistic arts questions, but also discussions on the topic of liturgical renewal or social questions. There was a widely debated so-called priestly question, which meant discussion of the role of a priest in the current society, especially to do with the problem of the material resources of the paternal law of celibacy and the relationship to some civic elites coming, especially teachers, who even in the Austrian monarchy was emancipated. And from the past, when it was long under the control of the priests, it had a reserved or even a relationship of enemy to the church and to religion. The motivation of the leaders was a renewal of the nation via the renaissance of Catholicism on all levels, the arts, religion, social and political level. They knew that there was a real departure of a big part of society and culture from the religion and Catholicism, and this required to put aside passivity and repeating the traditional approaches and need to look for new expressions and forms. The aim was to use suitable reforms and put the new era in terms with a Catholic Church, a Catholic belief, renewal of external practice of the Church, without somehow going into the doctrinal questions. In 1902, in the Czech lands, a country union of Czech Catholic priesthood was founded, and it was approved by the church and also state organizations and institutions. On its regular meetings, about 300 members were taking part. In 1903, already, we can see a text of Dostal Lutinov, which speaks about a refusal from the bishop's side. And it also says that the beginnings were of a church singing, which was renewing the church art, sacred art, and it never had the aspiration of reforming the church. The young priests who were full of idealism and zeal for the Catholic Church went into the cultural battle. They were trying to defend the church in front of the world, but they were only able to do it within the culture. On its gatherings and synods, especially in Przerov in 1906, a program was formulated which was requiring democratization of the church, election of the bishops, and fraternal relationship between bishops and priests, a bigger influence of lay people on the church matters, founding of a Czech patriarchate, which would be a renewal of the Syro-Methodian tradition, celibacy which would not be obligatory, reform of patronate law, and material support for the priest. There was also a requirement to be able to celebrate the liturgy in national languages, a reform of teaching religion at school, freedom of gathering for the clergy, education of the seminarians on a higher level for their independence. In the atmosphere of anti-modernist battle, the union was facing a frequent enmity of the bishop, who didn't trust the so-called trade organization of the priests. They were blaming it for modernism and gradually canceling one reform magazine after another. After two papal anti-modernist documents in 1907 were published, the ordinariates cancelled the union as a modernist organization, and it was they couldn't explain that the papal documents were not applying to this union.
After 1989, we can see the effort to enforce the traditional structures and renew the organization of theological faculties and other institutions like charities and schools. But around, we can see the critics in the church. The church focused too much on its inner problems and on the renewal of its institutional frame. And it doesn't communicate enough with the laity and in the public life. It's hard to explain the sense of its mission to a laity, they think. There was a division into progressive and conservative wing, where conservativity involved is battling against Cardinal Locke. We can see the symptoms of decline in interest religious professions. At the end, there's an idea of making some kind of a balance about the first years of life in the free country or free society. This decision was made in January 1996. The Plenary Council of Catholic Church in the Czech Republic, which was approved by the Apostolic. In 1997, the conception is clarified. New impulses of the Second Vatican Council are about to be approved. The other main aims of the plenary synod is spiritual renewal, new impulses for the church service, and for the Catholic Church to find their place in the Czech nation and tradition. The Council is supposed to have several years taking preparation phase. German church organizations were supposed to support it. Mostly they were formed by younger clerical workers. They tended to work for 14 days for 4 years. They formulated their statements, which were dominated by questions how to change the church in order to respond to the needs of today's believers. There was a committee founded, and in January 1998, 4 specialized committees about the church, liturgy, God's word, and the church in the world. This was followed by discussions about individual documents. Committees themselves started to talk about the council rounds. Only bishops were considered to be legitimized members, which means 16 bishops at that time. Deputy generals, deans of theological faculties, and also representatives of male and female religious orders. There were 130 of them, plus around 30 chosen priests and chosen lay people. The final number wasn't supposed to overcome 200. The first convention took place in 2003. The second and the last one took place in Belehrad in 2005. There were 8 committees in total. Just to summarize quickly, there was a committee for the spiritual history, analytical committee for evangelization and missionaries, commission for priests, a commission for lay people, a commission for liturgies, for particular law, and pastoral committee. The main outcome was to document the life of the Christians in the church and in the world, which was then sent to Vatican after being modified a little bit. There were other 3 documents. When it comes to the whole summary, it's very difficult to say. When it comes to its reception, it's best illustrated by an article by Josef Greš in the magazine Respect in 2005. They were very impressed. The bishops were very impressed. The lay people not so much. Especially the published documents represented a huge disappointment. Thousands of Catholics or believers invested a lot of time and energy into it, and it didn't bring about any changes or impulses into the life of the Czech Catholic Church. They were sort of disgusted by the clerical approach. It's up to date a traumatizing experience for all the participants. That's why when a synodal process was introduced, general approach was very skeptical and they were reserved. If I have to summarize my presentation, there was 3 synods. I can assume that although Catholic Church has in its history a tradition of synodal approach and democratic and geological culture, and despite of these elements being verbally voiced and supported by the Church,
it seems that the Church is unable to use the power and the potential that is included in the elements of the synodal process. We can ask whether the problems of these efforts didn't contribute to these negative experiences. In the first two efforts, we can see that it was especially priestly or even clerical matter, primarily focused on the inner renewal and optimization of the running of the church organization. The second one, on the threshold of the 19th and 20th century, had some symptoms of the change as to a bigger interest of the world, in the world over there, outside, and taking into consideration the laity in the church. The last effort of synodality, despite all the positive side, ended by a failure. So despite a great effort of thousands of engaged lay people, the result was zero.
The Faculty of Theology at Villanova in the United States is interested in the modern history of the Church, the Vatican Council, and the contemporary pontificate of Pope Francis. One of his recent books is called Pontificate of Pope Francis to a Global Catholicism.
One passage of the Pope's remarks stand out. Quote, "What needs to be done today is to accompany the Church in a deep spiritual renewal. I believe that the Lord wants a change in the Church. I've said many times that a perversion of the Church today is clericalism. But 50 years ago, the Second Vatican Council said this clearly. The Church is the people of God. Read number 12 of Lumen Gentium. I know the Lord wants the Council to make headway in the Church. Historians tell us that it takes 100 years for a council to be applied. We are halfway there. So if you want to help me, do whatever it takes to move the council forward in the Church. And help me with your prayer. I need so many prayers." End quote. This remark exemplifies the situation of the Church under Francis' pontificate. After 3 pontificates that were more concerned with controlling excesses and extravagances in the implementation of the council than with deepening its reception and application, Francis is trying to unleash the potential of Vatican II in a church and a world that are both, in certain important respects, post-Vatican II. And this is both the hope and the constraint of Pope Francis' pontificate. 50 years after Vatican II, Catholicism has moved beyond Vatican II. Some Catholics simply take for granted what Vatican II said and did, seeming to forget how much and how quickly the Church has changed in a few decades. And they demand further progress and developments in both doctrine and discipline. Other Catholics want instead to roll back the reforms of Vatican II for a more traditionalist version of Catholicism. Vatican II either ignored or failed to anticipate some of the most controversial issues within today's church. For example, the council never addressed the issue of married priests, one of the issues that was withdrawn from the debate by Paul VI, and never addressed the role of women in church's ministry and governance, because Vatican II took place too early for this debate. From an ecclesiological perspective, Vatican II was a victory for both the papacy and the episcopate at the expense of the lower clergy and religious orders, with some consolation prizes for the non-ordained in a so-called theology of the laity that is largely pre-Vatican II. The council counted on the episcopate to lead church reform, but the history of the abuse crisis tells a story of systemic failure on the part of the bishops. At Vatican II, the reconciliation of Catholicism with modernity presupposed also a kind, respectful relationship between religion and politics, between church and state. It assumed a papacy and an episcopate firmly in control of the ecclesiastical hierarchy and of the laity. There could be no starker difference between a division of Vatican II back then and our current situation on this point today. Today, many Catholics do not feel at home either in their political community or in their church. They are without a Catholic party or a political culture they can relate to. And many of them feel no longer that they and their children are safe in the church or welcome. The cooperative relationship between church and world imagined by Vatican II was a development of the so-called Ecclesiology of the two swords of church and empire that assumed a degree of internal cohesion and control within both the church and the political realm, a system that found its most perfect realization in the instrument of concordance between the Holy See and the secular authorities in the nation states. That parallelism between church and state has been radically redefined by globalization and the replacement of the traditional elites with technocrats. Neither governments nor the institutional church are in control of the flow of information in the way they once were. And the media and media platforms that are in control of that flow feel no obligation to protect the church or to cooperate with it. There is no possible concordance between the Holy See and the media, included a Catholic media system that no longer sees itself as constrained by loyalty to a legitimate elected pope. As Francis reminds us, quote, historians tell us that it takes 100 years for a council to be applied, and we are halfway there, end quote. This was certainly true for the Council of Trent, in an age when it took the average diocese about a century, for example, to build a seminary. And that was more or less true also for Vatican I. And it's not an accident that major crisis for papal primacy came with Paul VI encyclical Humanae Vitae in 1968, almost exactly 1 century after Pastor Eternus of Vatican I. But then Vatican II was importantly different from those previous councils in various ways, especially in the new kind of conciliar teaching it offered and in its recognition that Catholicism was becoming truly global. The world seemed to be changing faster than it used to, and so did the church. All this is part of a dramatic power shift in the church and in the world. Vatican II took place before the social and cultural upheavals of the late 60s and 1970s. Francis seems more attentive to developments in the post-Vatican II period when it comes to the ad extra issues, social justice, ecumenism, interreligious dialogue, than when it comes to the ad intra ones, especially the role of women in the church. For the second category of issues, Francis' teaching is restricted by the limits not only of the final documents of the council, but also by the limits of the theology of Vatican II. And for example, also of the theology of Yves Congar. The real asset for Francis in overcoming these objective and subjective limits is exactly synodality, which is a word that is nowhere to be found in the corpus of the Second Vatican Council, where the operational word for dialogue in the church was Episcopal Collegiality, which obtains only among the bishops and between them and the Pope. Synodality, a fundamental dimension of the church involving the whole people of God at all levels, universal, continental, national, diocesan, parochial, is truly a post-Vatican II theological and magisterial development. It is a remarkable fact that until 2013, the Bishop Synod was, in my opinion, synodal in name only. It was created by Paul VI in 1965 as an expression of episcopal collegiality and not of the synodality of the whole church. So synodality is the most important institutional reform of Francis' pontificate. The role of the Bishop Synod has changed, and synodality at all levels of the church has been encouraged as never before. Whatever the upcoming apostolic constitution for the reform of the Roman Curia will say, there's no question that the Curia has played a marginal role in this pontificate, much more marginal than its role in any prior pontificate of the modern era. The trend toward greater and greater centralization within the church is finally beginning to reverse under Francis. The real parallel here is with the pontificate of John the 23rd, the Pope who was elected in October 1958. When Pope John called the Second Vatican Council, most expected that its function would be to complete the work of the First Vatican Council. But Vatican II turned out to be a very different in kind. In a similar way, Francis is appealing to the Council in order to open the way for a synodal church that was not quite born at Vatican II, but was theologically conceived at Vatican II. And Jorge Mario Bergoglio is a product of conciliar Catholicism, and at the same time, is also the first post-Vatican II Pope. He was elected as a successor of Pope Benedict, who engaged in a critical re-examination of the legacy of the Second Vatican Council, an effort that I think produced disturbing effects in the theological and ecclesiological culture of so-called conservative and traditionalist Catholicism. In just a few years, the papacy went from a defense of Vatican II as, quote, a sure compass to guide the course of Peter's bark. Those words come from John Paul II's Testament. It came from that period through a period under Benedict in which Rome indulged the traditionalist dissent from Vatican II. And we have now, with Pope Francis, the Pope's embrace of post-Vatican II synodality. Here, Francis' emphasis on synodality bridges the gap between his Vatican II theological culture and the new horizon of a post-conciliar global Catholicism. And it is a bridge that it cannot cross alone. But here there are some open questions that I think are important for the transition from collegiality to synodality. 6.5 years after he delivered what can be called his Magna Carta on synodality to the 2015 Assembly of the Bishop Synod, Pope Francis' persistent push in favor of a synodal church is having effects. In different areas of the Catholic world, there are ecclesial events of a synodal nature that are unfolding or being prepared. There is Australia Historic Plenary Council. There's the synodal path in Germany. Preparation are being made for a national synod in Ireland. And after much insistence from the Pope, also the Church in Italy is beginning plans for its own synod. The editors of the Jesuit-run magazine America in the United States have recently argued in favor of a plenary council for the Catholic Church in the United States. At the supranational level, the Latin American bishops have celebrated their own ecclesial assembly, the first ever ecclesial assembly of Latin America and the Caribbean. So the synodal moment is unfolding at the time of great uncertainty due to the coronavirus pandemic, and I should add also the war in Eastern Europe. The synodality, which means the people of the church walking together, requires gathering together in assemblies. And it's not certain that participants from poor countries or countries at war will be able to gather locally for the preparation phase, or that the representatives will be able to travel to Rome in 2023. And so far, most of the discussions on synodality have focused on its pastoral aspects. But a two-article dossier published by Serena Nocetti, Rafael Luciani, and Hervé Legrand in the 8th issue of the 2021 year of the Italian magazine Il Regno pointed out that there are theological and institutional dimensions to synodality that need attention. And I will spend a few words here on the institutional aspects. One particular aspect that will have to be addressed is the role of papal primacy in synodality, both at the universal level and at the national, local level. This is a key issue that will have important practical consequences. In one of his first and most important speeches on the model of episcopal leadership in September 2013, Francis talked about the bishop in these terms, quote, "A pastoral presence means walking with the people of God, walking in front of them, showing them the way, showing them the path, but also walking in their midst to strengthen them in unity, but also walking behind them to make sure no one gets left behind, but especially never to lose the scent of the people of God in order to find new roads," end quote. Now, what is the role of episcopal leadership in the synodal path together with the people of God, walking in front of them, in their midst, or behind them? What we have seen from the Synod of Bishops Assembly for the Amazon region of October 2019 and its aftermath with the exhortation Crede Amazonia of February 2020, Francis seems to understand his role as the, I would say, referee of the presence or absence of genuine discernment in a synodal event. This is how Francis phrased it in a note published in September 2020 by the editor of Civiltà Cattolica, Father Antonio Spadaro. End quote. At the 2019 Synod, there was a discussion, a rich discussion, a well-founded discussion, but no discernment, which is something other than arriving at a good and justified consensus or relative majorities. We must understand that the Synod is more than a parliament. And in this specific case, the Synod could not escape this dynamic. On this issue, the 2019 Synod was a rich, productive, and even necessary parliament, but no more than that. For me, this was decisive in the final discernment when I thought about how to write the exhortation Crede Amazonia, end quote. This way of assessing synodality is, in my opinion, more typical of the superior of a religious community that has undertaken a process of discernment than that of a bishop. The Catholic Church is not the society of Jesus. Discernment works, if at all, in very rarefied spiritual groups, and most bishops have no background or training in it. And the same, of course, can be said for the people of God who are supposed to be involved in synodality. It's especially since the late 1990s, also thanks to John Paul II encyclical Ut Unum Sint of 1995, that we have started talking about a new role for the papacy in the ecumenical ecclesiology articulated at the Second Vatican Council. In a long article published in 2000 in Cristianesimo nella Storia, the Tübingen Emeritus Professor Peter Hunerman formulated the concept of the papacy as, quote, notarius publicus, a public notary. The primacy's constitutive role, in this sense, would be the task of facilitating and maintaining the unity of Catholic faith and of the communion of the Church. Hunerman's essay was a commentary on John Paul's II Motu Proprio Ad Tuendam Fidem of 1998. And so here Hunerman offered an historical perspective on the development of papal primacy, trying to understand the deep changes in the function of primacy for the Church in modernity. He also noted that the Vatican I paradigm of papal primacy as a primacy of jurisdiction in stark legal terms had been overcome not just by ecumenical outlook of Catholicism, but also by the self-understanding of the papacy as communicative action. Now, especially after Vatican II, we know, I think, that papal primacy is not really or no longer about defining the faith. Rather, it is about witnessing and confirming the faith of the people, voiced in the consensus of the representatives and in light of scripture and tradition. Hunerman wrote the article well before the papacy embraced synodality, but it is still relevant for this current debate. Of course, the approaches to the issue of the role of primacy depend on the kind of synodality we have in mind. Is synodality a way to renew the pastoral style of the Church in the already existing institutional and theological system? Or is it a moment for addressing issues such as the role of women in the church and ministry, and opening the church to the possibility of institutional and theological developments? This is, in my opinion, an essential question that will have to be clarified at some point. Here, primacy has emerged in recent years as an ecumenical issue, especially when one looks at the role it plays in the intra-Orthodox rifts between Constantinople and Moscow. We should recall the tensions on display in January 2019 when the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew conceded the autocephaly to the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and all that has followed since then. The specter of a universal pope-like role for Constantinople haunts some Eastern Orthodox churches today. But here also, for us Catholics, the complicated nature of papal primacy should not be too quickly overlooked. It tends to be dismissed as relevant because of the friendly, genteel style of Pope Francis. But if synodality is to be a key aspect of being church in the future of Catholicism, this means that we need to keep in mind that at some point there will be another pope, and it could have a way and style of interpreting synodality that is very different from that of the current bishop of Rome, Pope Francis. Now, here a few conclusions. Any proposals for synodality must consider the need to look at reform, not just in the institutional church at three levels: universal, global, continental, national, and local, but also must look at the situation of global Catholicism today. Some of the new forms of Catholic ecclesial communities, lay movements, new communities, have remained largely impermeable, untouched by the ecclesiological discourse on collegiality and synodality, and have developed their own ecclesiology that helped them flourish, also because of their rejection of the emphasis on the institutional aspects of reform. And at the same time, they flourished also because of an idea of Christian community that relies more on charisma than on church leadership, that is legitimized by collegial and synodal practices. One of the signs of our times is the deep distrust of institutions, including ecclesial institutions. Any project for a synodal reform must take into account the real situation, the multicultural nature of Christianity in the global world takes place at the same time of the crisis of globalization, with the Catholic Church and the world both more tribal and polarized than during the early post-Vatican II period. This is one of the major differences between the Catholic Church of Pope Francis' pontificate from when the ecclesiological debate on synodality started in a very different post-Vatican II moment. I want to thank you very much for your patience, and I'm looking forward to your questions or comments. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Massimo. What is your opinion? What should be the role of the theological faculties?
I think there should be a bigger role for sure. So what has been encouraging is that the experts that have been appointed as experts by the Bishop Synod for this whole process are real experts. I mean, they have been chosen largely knowing that they are experts in this field, in ecclesiology, but that has been done on an individual basis. I believe that there has been the choice, and I don't know how much was intentional, but to keep theological faculties a little distant. And I know for a fact that that was intentional, for example, by the American bishops. I mean, that has been clear. And I don't know other countries or the Vatican. This is really part of a mutual estrangement. So here, the church has lost trust in theologians for various reasons. And from what I can see in the United States, also many Catholic theologians are not as interested as they should be. So there should be also some self-critical reflection from the part of theologians, because I'm afraid that this whole process will happen without a vital communication in these two worlds. So I don't know what is the situation in Europe. In North America, there is a clear detachment at the institutional level on this.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. My question for you is, how do you read Pope Francis and his comfortability with reform in the church, especially when it comes to doctrine? Do you think he's open to that kind of reform, and how should it come about?
So this is a difficult question, and it is an important one, because I believe that we have known Pope Francis, and we know more about him now than 9 years ago. So it is clear that he's much more courageous or audacious even on social issues, on immigration, on capitalism, all of that. He's much more cautious on doctrinal issues that go beyond a pastoral openness to a church that is non-judgmental. And so that is much already. But I believe that this church needs some changes in the books, in the catechism, in the language on some issues on which I think Pope Francis is not there yet. So I don't know where he stands on some issues. I think that it will depend much on what happens in this process. So here, I believe a central point will be what will be made in Rome of the German Synod, because that is the most advanced position, that is expression of an entire church, basically. And there's a distance between Francis and the German Synod on several issues. So I am waiting for that moment. But again, I don't think it's about what Pope Francis personally believes, but what he will be able to hear from the churches. And of course, it's possible that there will be some issues that go beyond what Pope Francis is ready to accept, and it will be a decisive moment, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tak vďaka za vaše otázky.
Thank you very much for your questions. To you, Professor, as well. And we are going to continue by another speaker, introduced by Mr. Juhas. Our following speaker is going to be Martin Magyar. He's one of the organizers of this conference. Originally, he comes from Slovakia, from Bardejov, Marhaňa. For more than 20 years, he's been living and working in the USA.
He is an associate professor in the Department of Theology at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. He specializes in systematic theology, particularly in ecclesiology. He is the author of the book titled The Church of God and Its Human Face, which investigates the contribution of Joseph Komenchuk to ecclesiology.
I started my theological education in Košice more than 25 years ago at what was then a theological institute of the Comenius University. That is just one reason why Košice has a special place in my heart. I'm very glad that I have this opportunity to be with you all and contribute to a discussion of synodality, which is undoubtedly one of the most important topics in the Catholic Church today. In my presentation, I will be drawing connections between synodality and two tenets of the Ecclesiology of Vatican II. My central point will be that synodality breathes new life into the view of the Church as the people of God and to the theology of the local Church. So here I go. Unlike his predecessor, Pope Francis did not issue a formal statement soon after becoming Pope, laying out a proper hermeneutic of Vatican II, but over time it became clear that the Council, especially its continual reception, is at the center of his pontificate. After issuing a motu proprio Traditionis Custodes last summer, which provided new norms for the celebration of the pre-Vatican II liturgy, one commentator noted that the decree is a decisive moment in the reception of Vatican II on the part of Francis. It can be seen as Francis asserting his interpretation sovereignty over the legacy of Vatican II. This decisive step happened at a time of uncertainty regarding the future of the Council's reception. Until recently, discussions about the Council were focused on its proper interpretation and implementation. Now it seems, however, that the key question for a significant segment of Catholics is whether the Council was a mistake, whether it should be rejected, and assigned blame for the problems the Church has faced since its close. By taking control over the narrative about the Council, Francis is intervening and saying a resolute no to such a misguided proposal. Instead, he is trying to reinvigorate the experience of the Church that people had following the reforms of the Council. One could say that he has inaugurated a new phase in the reception of Vatican II. What we see happening is that Francis is overturning the narrative that his predecessors delivered, the final definitive interpretations of all key issues that the Council addressed. Perhaps the most significant initiative of Pope Francis regarding the continual reception of Vatican II is synodality. Since becoming Pope in 2013, he has convened 4 synodal assemblies, and now we are in the midst of preparing for the next one, which will explore the topic of synodality itself. What is Pope Francis after with his call to synodality? It is not perfectly clear. On the one hand, it seems that Francis's understanding of synodality keeps evolving with time, and in some respect, it is a moving target. But it also appears evident that his call for a synodal church is an attempt to implement more robustly the Council's vision of the Church. It is a call for the Church to become more dialogical, in which voices of all the faithful are heard and taken into consideration in decision-making. As a word, synodality does not appear in the documents of Vatican II. There are operational words for dialogue in the Church is Episcopal Collegiality, which designates a modus operandi only among the bishops and between them and the Pope. Synodality, as we are thinking about it today, is thus a post-Vatican II development. From a theoretical point of view, synodality attempts to integrate collegial and hierarchical modes of church governance. The latter is firmly established. That is why, at present, synodality can be seen as an attempt to stretch the concept of collegiality and extend it to all the corners of the church. Synodality is a way of being church. It means walking together along a common path and being an itinerary church in which all the baptized work together. The point of synodality is to discern together and listen to each other in order to find out how best to be the church that we are called to be. Although Pope Francis is the first Pope in 50 years not to have participated in Vatican II, he has profound appreciation of the Council and the transforming scope of its decrees. Two aspects of the Council pertinent to synodality that he particularly appropriated are the Council's description of the Church as the people of God and its wide-ranging insistence on a collegial mode of church governance. Two tenets of Vatican II's Ecclesiology are indispensable for a synodal church as Pope Francis envisions it. They are the view of the Church as people of God and understanding of the universal Church as a communion of local churches. The former grounds the idea that all the faithful ought to participate in synodality, and the latter grounds the idea that synodality integrates the collegial and hierarchical modes of church governance. With the Synodality project, we see these two important aspects of Vatican II's ecclesiology making a comeback to the center of Catholic ecclesiology. Vatican II was mainly concerned with the Church. Among several shifts that it affected in the Catholic Church, one of the most important concerns ecclesiology. The shift was in the making for some time. Essentially, it consisted of moving away from an overly institutional view of the Church to an ecclesiology that brings out the Church's transcendent spiritual dimension. The central affirmation of Vatican II's ecclesiology is that the Church is more than its structures and laws. In its innermost reality, the Church is a participation in the triune life of God, on whom its very existence depends. One way the Council made the point that the Church is more than its structures and laws is by describing it as the people of God. The view of the Church as the people of God was reintroduced into Catholic ecclesiology in the first half of the 20th century by the Ressourcement theologians. They turned into ancient and medieval theological sources, which led to a retrieval of ideas that once had been at the center of theological reflection on the Church, but were later overshadowed by an ecclesiology that prioritized the idea of the Church as an institution and society. The notion of the Church as the people of God developed in the 1940s and 1950s and was seen as a corrective voice to several alleged weaknesses of the mystical body ecclesiology. Its critics argued that it left unclear the relationship between the visible and the invisible aspects of the Church. They also contended that envisioning the Church in terms of a living organism, like a human body, resulted on occasions with a false identification of an individual Christian with Christ and led to an erroneous mysticism which obscured the distinction between creator and creature. The idea of the Church as the people of God introduced a certain dynamism into the concept of the Church. It communicated the notion that the Church was more than the institution possessing all the means of grace. The Church was a people who heard God's call and answered it. This view of the Church thus enriched the understanding of the Church's continuity with the chosen people of Israel and expressed the idea that the Church is a people on a journey. In connection with the idea of the Church as the people of God, the notion of the pilgrim church, common among the Church Fathers, was also retrieved. It highlighted the Church's historical and eschatological dimensions. It allowed one to distinguish between the Church as the people on the journey and the kingdom of God, which is their destination. This distinction became a key presupposition in discussions about the possibility of reform in the Church. Vatican II incorporated the view of the Church as the people of God into its ecclesiology. People of God became the title of the second chapter of its dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium. Based on the editorial history of the document, We know that in the second draft, People of God was initially the title of the third chapter. It was preceded by the chapters on the Church as mystery and on the hierarchical constitution of the Church. Cardinal Swannon suggested, however, that since the chapter on the people of God concerned all the faithful, including the clergy, it can be moved before the chapter on the hierarchy. This editorial change marked a profound shift in the Council's vision of the Church. The change communicated the point that the Church is not first the clergy, it is first of all the whole people of God, and that believers share oneness and baptism equality that precedes the distinctions among different roles in the community. People of God is thus not a designation of the laity or of the clergy, but of all the faithful, the Christi Fideles. Describing the Church as the people of God and insisting that it refers to all the baptized, addressed the charge of a clericalism in the initial schema of the Church. It created a contrast with the tendency of pre-conciliar ecclesiology to identify the Church primarily with the ordained and religions. The description of the Church as the people of God in Lumen Gentium set forth several other topics in ecclesiology, such as that of divine election, the common priesthood of all believers, and the ministerial priesthood, the sense of the faith, charisms, Catholicity of the Church, and its being an eschatological community. It is evident that the notion of the Church as the people of God is not marginal, but central to the Council's ecclesiology. Unfortunately, in the process of the Council's reception, it lost the prominence it was afforded in the Council's documents. The view of the Church as the people of God became controversial. It was alleged that this notion was sometimes put to ideological use. This happened in two distinct but often interrelated ways. First, it was by giving the people of God particular political meanings, identifying the people in the term with a social or economic class, particularly the poor. Second, the notion of the Church as the people of God was misused ideologically by counterposing a people's church or a church from below to the hierarchical church or church from above. The former used people of God as a religious legitimation of political options, while the latter appealed at times to notions of democratic participation drawn from liberal society in such a way as to suggest that the Church needs to be reinvented de novo from the ground up. The 1985 Extraordinary Synod of Bishops can be seen as a clear historical marker in sidelining the idea of the Church as the people of God. The Synod was convoked to really review, evaluate, and celebrate the achievement of Vatican II 2 decades after its close. One section of the Synod's final report presented the Council's vision of the Church. It focused on the notions of the Church as mystery and communion, but conspicuously left out the notion of the Church as the people of God. This denigration of the idea of the people of God is unfortunate, for it interrupted the reception of an important truth about the Church, namely that it designates all the baptized, that it refers first and foremost to all the faithful, including the ordained. It is possible that if the alleged ideological abuses of the notion of the people of God were corrected, instead of sidelining the concept, we would have made much needed advances in overcoming clericalism in the Church and would have been better prepared for Pope Francis's call to synodality. Synodality is based on the idea that all the faithful, the laity and the ordained, are walking together. Pope Francis's call to synodality is a rejection of a whole culture in which the clergy know what is best for the Church, and the role of the laity is simply to pray, pay, and obey. Understanding of the Church as the whole people of God is indispensable for a synodal Church. Therefore, the synodality initiative of Pope Francis breathes new life into this view of the Church. It facilitates its reception. The second tenet of the Ecclesiology of Vatican II that the current discussion of synodality has revived is the theology of the local church. Catholic ecclesiology recognizes two dimensions of the church, local and universal. How one envisions these two dimensions of the church can make a big difference. The New Testament speaks of the church and of the churches without the qualifying adjectives such as local, particular, whole, or universal, which later became key categories in ecclesiology. Once these terms entered theological discourse, it became possible to distinguish two basic conceptions of the church. The first, documented since the 2nd century and prevalent in the first millennium in both East and West, envisions the church as a communion of local churches. The second, characteristic of Roman Catholic ecclesiology in the 2nd millennium, envisions the church as a universal entity governed by the Pope. This church is like a single diocese encompassing the whole world. In this latter view, dioceses are not considered churches the same way as the universal church. They are deficient in their ecclesial character. Essentially, they are seen as administrative units of the whole church and to some extent as extensions of the local Church of Rome. This latter view has its origin in the Gregorian reforms in the 11th century, but became dominant only after the Council of Trent and especially after the First Vatican Council. During this period, concepts such as societas in equalium, hierarchica, and perfecta began to be used by ecclesiologists and canonists to refer to the church. In these ecclesiological perspectives, the local church was not considered fully church because it lacked the totality of jurisdictional power, even though it did not lack anything in terms of sacramental life. Following Vatican I, local churches were often treated in effect as branch offices of the universal church. Vatican II recognized that such understanding of the local church was discontinuous from the larger tradition and attempted to articulate the tradition's breadth by counterbalancing one-sided universal ecclesiology with the ecclesiology prevalent during the first millennium. The council succeeded only partially. Although the council did not treat the topic of the local church as thoroughly as it did the notion of the church as the people of God, one point is clear, namely that the local church is holy church even though it is not the whole church. The council restored the local church to its full ecclesial reality and reinserted into Catholic ecclesiology the concept that the universal church is the church of churches. Among the most significant statements in this regard is the assertion of Lumen Gentium 23 that the universal church exists in and out of the local churches. After the council, this rediscovery of the local church became a catalyst for several developments. It grounded the implementation of the liturgical reform. It led to the emergence of so-called local theologies. It resulted in a greater appreciation of the various cultures in which local churches exist and was the catalyst for enculturation. It was also a source of hope that the church would become less centralized and more collegial. In more than one way, then, the theology of the local church could be seen as a hallmark of the Council's ecclesiological vision. During the first 2 decades after the Council, theology of the local church was among the hottest trends in ecclesiology. It was calling a lot of attention because it was seen, together with collegiality, as a means of bringing about a much-needed decentralization of the church. Many hoped that diocesan bishops would become real pastors instead of being practically vicars of the Pope, and that the universal church would function as a communion of local churches rather than a corporation with headquarters in Rome. This hope was alive for some time, but as with the notion of the church as the people of God, the reception of the Council's theology of the local church eventually came to a halt. Heightened interest in the local church persisted until the 1990s, when it was disrupted first by a 1992 letter Communionis Notio from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and later by the 1998 apostolic letter Apostolos Suos on the theological and juridical nature of episcopal conferences. Communionis Notia treated some aspects of the Church as communion and argued that the universal Church is a reality that is ontologically and temporally prior to every individual particular church. The letter sparked a vigorous debate, probably best known through the back and forth exchanges between the then Cardinal Ratzinger and Cardinal Kasper. The critics of the letter pointed out that it disrupted a careful balance that the Council kept regarding the relationship of the Church, local and universal. It seems that the Council asserted the mutual interrelationship in the sense of inclusion and interiority between the local churches and the universal Church. In Lumen Gentium 23, it said that local churches are constituted after the model of the universal Church, and that the universal Church is formed in and out of them. The question of priority should not really arise. By asserting priority of the universal Church over the local churches, Communionis Notia suggested that local churches are simply subdivisions of the universal Church. Apostolos Suos treated the nature of episcopal conferences, in particular their magisterial authority, and stated that the teaching of such conferences constitute authentic magisterium when approved unanimously by the conference. Otherwise, the conference must achieve a 2/3 majority and seek the recognitio, that is, an approval of the Holy See, which they will not receive if the majority is not substantial. The decision to deny genuine teaching authority to national conferences of bishops ended the hopes for the Church's decentralization. After 1998, one basically stopped hearing about the theology of the local Church. But the current pontificate is reviving the interest in the local Church again. Pope Francis has reopened several issues that seemed to have been closed by his predecessors. One is how decisions should be made in the Church. Synodality is in large part about that. In his 2013 apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, Francis made it clear that he did not believe that the papal magisterium should be expected to offer a definitive or complete word on every question which affects the Church and the world. It is not advisable for the Pope to take the place of local bishops in the discernment of every issue which arises in their territory. In this sense, I am conscious of the need to promote a sound decentralization. That was Evangelii Gaudium 16. In the same exhortation, Francis expressed his concern that the intent of the Second Vatican Council, which would give episcopal conferences genuine doctrinal authority, has not yet been sufficiently elaborated. Francis made several steps that can be seen as giving local churches more say. In 2017, he issued a motu proprio Magnum Principium, through which he modified canon law, granting episcopal conferences specific authority to faithfully prepare, approve, and publish the liturgical books for the regions for which they are responsible after the confirmation of the Apostolic See. Subsequently, he issued a letter addressed to the prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship and the disciple of sacraments, discipline of sacraments, clarifying that the Holy See and its departments would have only limited authority to confirm liturgical translations recognized by a local episcopal conference. It should also be noted that the preparation for the Synod on Synodality has started with extensive consultations on the local level. First on the level of dioceses, and will proceed on the level of various geographical regions before it will conclude on the level of the whole Church. All this can be seen as a revival of an interest in the local Church once again. Promotion of synodality has been a signature pastoral initiative of Pope Francis. From the start of his pontificate, he made it clear that he wishes the Church to be revitalized in its mission to mediate God's saving love to the world. Francis sees synodality as a means of discerning concrete steps to achieve this goal. A synodal church is one in which everyone has a voice. The reason is that the people of God have a profound grasp of the faith and practice of the church. Therefore, they must be listened to. Synodality means listening to one another, even if, in the final instance, one person must shoulder the sole responsibility. It makes a great difference if someone decides alone or listens to the community. In this presentation, I have argued that synodality breathes new life to the view of the church as the people of God and to the notion of the local church. These two important tenets of the Ecclesiology of Vatican II are being revived. One could say that Pope Francis's call for a synodal church is releasing Vatican II's bold vision from captivity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this courageous, assessment of what has happened in these last 4 decades, more or less, on synodality and ecclesiology. My question is, as a fellow ecclesiologist, how do you think that ecclesiological thinking has responded to Pope Francis' invitation? Has there been enough embrace or reaction? How do you see that? Because I don't know what to think about the response of theologians to Pope Francis, and I'm curious to see how you assess that in light of what you have said about the previous decades.
Massimo, ďakujem za tvoju otázku.
Thank you for your question. It's rather difficult. I think that the ecclesiologists, especially where I live in the USA, are rather behind in the call to synodality. From what I see, it seems that the project of Rafael LUCIANI and the group around him this group is more mature and is able to reflect upon what synodality expects from synodality more than somewhere else in the world, anywhere else in the world. In the last century, and also in the First Vatican Council, the papal primacy was really emphasized. Now the synodality is emphasized. Are these two, synodality and papal primacy, in contrast, or is it possible to put them in some kind of relationship or compatibility? This is also a very trivial question for a million, as we say. I think in this period, it's a real challenge for the Catholic Church to put these two terms in balance. And I think the term that has been put in a high position is really hard to put into some balance with a tradition. It is up to you as the Church, as the believers, how to find out, how to discover, with the help of the Holy Spirit, how to put these two ecclesial principles into some harmony. And if it wasn't possible, we are in big trouble. What does it mean if it's not possible to put them in some balance? I'm saying it because I myself don't know how to put them together, how the primacy can exist, ignoring all the bishops, all the believers, all the faithful. This privilege is given to the Pope because it was given to him by the First Vatican Council. The question is how the Pope is going to use it. I think that if this principle was put into practice in the widest scale, it would really be hard to put into some harmony with the synodality principle. Is there any more? Are there any more questions? Not at the moment. So let me announce a break, which will take until 4:30 p.m. when we will have another speaker, Rafael LUCIANI. For this moment, thank you for your attention and see you in half an hour. Dear friends, this is the one but last speaker. Rafael LUCIANI is originally from Venezuela. He's a professor at University of Andrés Bello in Venezuela and also Boston College School of Theology and Ministry in Boston. He was named a member of his book, Synodality, a new way of how to proceed in the church, is going to be published in June.
In 2021, he was appointed as expert of the Theological Commission for the Synod of Bishops. His scholarly expertise includes Ecclesiology, Vatican II, and Pope Francis. His book, Synodality, A New Way of Proceeding, will be available in June from Paulist Press. Vitajte, pán profesor, welcome.
It's a beautiful opportunity to talk about not only the synod but on synodality in the midst of this first phase of consultation. The church, as we know, has been convoked to a synod, and the theme of the synod is on synodality, communion, participation, and mission. But the synod, one of the novelties is that it will be a 2-year synod. It will not be in 2023. It has already started the October 9th, 2021. This is one of the biggest novelty in regards to the institution of the synod. It will be a 2-year synodal process culminating in the 16th Ordinary Assembly of the Synod of Bishops in Rome in October 2023. So there is a transition that we sometimes do not see enough of being an only Synod of Bishops towards a Synod of the whole Church of the people of God. Perhaps this is the most important event of the current phase of the reception of the Second Vatican Council under pontificate of Francis, because it involved the whole church. We're talking about approximately 114 Episcopal Conference of the Latin Rite, the Council of Eastern Catholic Patriarchs, 6 Patriarch Synods of Eastern Churches, 4 major Archiepiscopal Synods, 5 international Episcopal Councils. It's a huge consultation that comes from the grassroots, from communities, all the way up in 2 years to Rome, deepening the ecclesiology of the people of God in the Second Vatican Council, and in the light of a model of church of churches, is that Francis has convoked this synod and has said in the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the institution of the Synod of Bishops that the path of synodality is the path that God expects for the church of the third millennium. It's the path that God expects for the church of the third millennium. The third millennium implies a phrase that calls for a new institutional model. So we're not talking simply about practices, listening, discerning, decision-making, taking, but how can those practices embody a new institutional model for the church? And Francis does so in a context which is more urgent than ever to renew ecclesial life by taking advice and by building consensus. Two new practices for us, but that come from the tradition of the church. Taking advice and building consensus is the only way not only to connect with the tradition of the church, but to respond to the actual crisis of the church, putting into practice the famous principle of medieval canon law that says what affects all must be treated and approved by all. This practice is not new in the church. It is worth recalling the golden rule of Bishop Saint Cyprian that we have incorporated in the preparatory document as a model, and which can be seen as the synodal form of the first millennium and offers an appropriate interpretative framework for thinking about today's challenges. He always, in his practice, took advice from the presbyterate and built consensus with the people of God, were two fundamental experiences that throughout his episcopate was done in order to maintain the communion in the church. To this end, he was able to devise methods based on dialogue, on common discernment, which made possible the participation of all and not only of the presbyters in deliberation and decision-making in the church. We know how those practices were in the time of Saint Cyprian, even to the point of electing on behalf of a community, electing the bishop. So this is a practice, a first point practice that connects with the tradition, that recovers this tradition of the church, that is embracing now a new path towards a new institutional model, and that's the call that we have right now in this moment in the Synod. One of the first novelties in this institutional model is a church of listening. Inspired by this way of proceeding, Pope Francis describes the new ecclesial model in the following words, and I quote, "A synodal church is a church of listening. It is a reciprocal listening in which everyone has something to learn. It is listening to God to the point of hearing with him the cry of the people. And it is listening to the people to the point of breathing in them the will to which God calls us." This exercise of listening is indispensable in a synodal ecclesiology, since it starts from the recognition of the identity of the ecclesial subjects, laity, priests, religious, bishops, the Pope, based on horizontal relationships founded on the radicality of baptismal dignity, and in the participation in the common priesthood of all faithful. The church as a whole is qualified by means of listening processes in which each ecclesial subject contributes something that completes the identity and the mission of the other. Apostolicam Autocitatem, speaking about the laity, uses a beautiful word. We complete each other's vocation, each other's identity. Complete is not simply complementing, is the need of the other in order to realize my own vocation and my own subjectivity in the church. Such a model proposes overcoming unequal relationships of superiority and subordination and moving to the logic of mutual need. As Lumen Gentium states, this mutual need, not simply auxiliary need, but a mutual need that is essential to the realization of one's vocation. This is the spirit of the International Theological Commission when it affirms, and I quote, that a synodal church is a participatory and co-responsible church. In the exercise of synodality, it is called to articulate the participation of all, says the International Theological Commission, according to the vocation of each one with the authority conferred by Christ on the College of Bishops presided over by the Pope. The Commission says participation is based on the fact that all the faithful are empowered and called to place at the service of others their respective gifts received from the Holy Spirit. I always invite to read this important document, perhaps the more articulated document on synodality written under Francis' pontificate. And it's a very important document because it shows all the sides of this theology and the practice of synodality. So we can say that to be listened is a right of all the people, but to take advice based on that listening process is a duty proper to those who exercise authority. So it is not simply about listening, but listening implies to the authority to take advice based on what they have listened of the rest of the faithful. However, listening has another dimension. Through it, a process of reconfiguration of the theological cultural models of ecclesial organization is generated. This means what the Pope explains, that one listens to a people in a place and in a time, and the Pope says, in order to know what the Spirit says to the churches, a church of churches, and to find ways of proceeding according to each epoch that we are living. We can recall here the Synod for the Amazon when it said that the church, in number 66 of Querida Amazonia, the church reconfigures its own identity in listening to and dialoguing with the people, realities and histories of its territory. We cannot have, therefore, a church that is in the same, with the same model, in the same way of proceeding in every place, while the Church of Churches invites us from this ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council to inculturate and to reconfigure our own ways of being church according to our own realities, histories, and cultures. And such a synod that inserts in this process can be appreciated as the beginning of a process that can lead to a more profound adaptation, realization of the whole Christian life as Agentes invites us to. Because the bonds of history, language, and culture, which is shaped in interpersonal communications and their symbolic expressions, trace their particular face, favor in its concrete life the exercise of a synodal style. We cannot then separate our own ways of being in a place, culturally, theologically, historically, and the way in which the church, as a local church, as a church of churches, embodies and realizes this way. Hence, the importance of understanding that synodality is the most appropriate way for the genesis of the processes of identity and theological cultural reconfiguration of the church according to the times and to the cultures. To put an example, in Latin America, we're doing two processes right now of reforming an institution, which is the parish, according to the local realities, needs, culture, and the institutional models that work in those places. We are now having one process in Lima, Peru, and another process in the whole Church of Venezuela. And they are both trying to find how a parish needs to embrace a new institutional model in this time that connects with the people socially, economically, politically, and therefore the culture is important in order to think the institutional model in that place, in that locality, regarding what parish is today. So synodality is a more complete way of being church, because listening is not an end in itself. It takes place within the framework of a larger process. The International Theological Commission says that the whole community, not some, not a few, in the free and the rich diversity of its members, is summoned to pray, listen, analyze, dialogue, and advise, so that pastoral decisions may be made in conformity with God's will. We have here a series of relationships and communicative dynamics. We're talking about praying, listening, analyzing, dialoguing, advising, and pastoral decision-making. This creates a favorable environment to receive advice and to build consensus that will later translate into decisions. So it is important to take into account all these actions when undertaking a listening process. We're talking about praying, listening, analyzing, dialoguing, and advising, but the purpose in a synodal church of this path is not simply to meet and to know each other, or to simply hear each other and get to know each other, but the scope is to work together so that pastoral decisions can be made. So the scope of a synodal process ends in decision-making of the whole community. So as the text of the International Commission explains, it is the whole community, not a few, that leave the process in order to take as a whole decisions that will affect the whole, and that means the whole church. So this is one of the aspects that define the meaning and the goal of a synodal process and of this synod on synodality. And this is one of the notes of the synodal process that are giving more difficulty. How do we understand ourselves as a totality, as a community of faithful, where the authority has to be part of the same process as any other faithful? Because only by praying, by analyzing, by dialoguing, and by discerning, and by taking the decision together, can an institution like the church respond to the challenges of today's call, especially in the midst of the crisis that we're living in the church. Without this horizon in mind, one can run the risk of limiting the understanding and the exercise of synodality to a mere affective practice, without effectively translating it into concrete changes that would help to overcome the current clerical model of the institution. It is interesting that in the preparatory document of the synod, at the beginning, we incorporated a call for the reform, not simply conversion, a call for the reform of the church in light of clericalism. And at the end of the document, when you find the expression walking together, it says in an explicit mode that walking together means revising the relationships among the ecclesial subjects. How do we relate to each other, laity, presbyters, bishops? And then it says, if we fail to have an effective, not an affective, an effective translation into an institutional way of proceeding, synodality will become a mere desire in the church. For this reason, it is important to highlight that the current synod has a theological commission for the first time to accompany the process. And it has also a subcommission with the scope of connecting reforms with canon law and reforms with institutions that need to be reformed and changed in the light of a synodal way of proceeding. So we are living an event that becomes a process, not simply a meeting of a 1 month gathering in Rome, as it has been before, but an event of a 2-year process that it's in its totality, the synod process ongoing until 2023. So consistent with the theme it addresses and with the purpose of understanding the feeling of the whole universal church, the current synod ceases to be an event and becomes to be a process that begins with a first diocesan phase. It's an ecclesiology of the local churches, which is the ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council, but it is new in the practice of many churches. In Latin America, we have had this practice of the ecclesiology of local churches even before the Second Vatican Council, when SELAM, the Conference of Latin American Bishops, was created. And the Council of SELAM embodies a way of proceeding in which each local church collaborates with the other local church. So the figure, the model of church of churches is new in many regions of the world, and that embraces a new culture in terms of ecclesial practice that we have to learn. So the first exercise of synodality, the first level in the exercise of synodality is precisely the local church. Cardinal Grech, the secretary of the Synod of Bishops, said in one of his speeches the following, and I quote, "Considering that the particular churches in which and from which the one and only Catholic Church exists contribute effectively to the good of the whole mystical body, which is also the body of the churches, the full synodal process will only truly exist if the particular churches are involved in it." This is a profound call to the reception of the ecclesiology of local churches, because it is the starting point of what means to be church and how to build, in this case, a church that wants to embrace a synodal model of being and practicing. To understand what this implies, we can recall the words of Bishop SCHMIDT during the council. And he said, and I quote, "The teaching body, the bishops, does not rely exclusively on the action of the Holy Spirit on the bishops. It must," says Bishop SCHMIDT, "also listen to the action of the same Spirit in the people of God. Therefore, the teaching body not only speaks to the people of God, but also listens to the people in whom Christ continues his teaching." These words of Bishop SCHMIDT during the council are very enlightening to us today. So throughout this first synodal phase, the bishops must not only listen to the people of God, but also in the people of God as an integral part of it, and together with it, discern and elaborate the decisions. The International Theological Commission explains very clearly that in the process of elaborating and making decisions, we should all be involved, from the bishops to the laity. Then, when the decision is taken by the authority, the authority has already participated with the rest of the faithful throughout the listening, discerning, and making decision process. This is a very important way of understanding that synodality implies the involvement of all and not of a few in the whole process of being in church. Following Lumen Gentium 12, when it talks about the sensus fidei, Episcopalis Communio in number 5 says also that this totality of the faithful, from the bishops down to the last of the lay faithful, who show universal agreement in matters of faith and morals, the totality, not a part of, not a group of. What is then at stake is not the sentiment of individual bishops that will go to the Synod Assembly in 2023, but the sentiment of the whole church, or rather the census of the people of God that the bishop witnesses, the bishop bringing the witness of the local church is sharing in the assembly what the local church is through his voice, but it is not him as an individual giving an opinion in the assembly of the synod. And this changes precisely the way in which we understand the church. The diocesan phase is so important that the diocesan life should be assumed by the bishop and witnessed by the bishop, and that process is the process that he will take at the end to the final assembly. This then changes a lot because it's not a bishop giving an opinion without having participated in the local church of the process and then going just at the end to the last assembly. So we need a passage from an affective to an effective synodality. This is the challenge, or the synodalization of the whole church. Not simply having some synodal institutions, but the synodalization of the whole church. So perhaps one of the most important challenges for the ecclesiastical hierarchy will be the creation of mediations and procedures for the involvement of all the faithful and the establishment of the modalities of participation. This is today a big challenge. To put an example, in 2007, all the Latin American bishops gathered in Aparecida in Brazil, and we have this document that for Francis is one of his sources documents, the document of Aparecida. And in number 371, it says something that is a challenge for today's synodal institutional model. The bishops of Latin America said in the final and concluding document of Aparecida that the laity should participate in the discernment, in the decision-making, taking, in the planning and the execution of the whole ecclesial life. This is a huge call of the Latin American bishops in 2007. We are still today in this challenge. How do we understand the participation in the whole process of the ecclesial life and not in some parts of it? If the way of proceeding of a synodal church has, as Francis has said, its point of departure and its point of arrival in the people of God, and if synodality is a constitutive dimension of the whole church, then it is necessary to do everything possible so that this synod will lead to an authentic synodalization of the whole church. It will be key, for example, to discern models of decision-making in the church, to articulate the elaboration of decisions, decision-making, and the taking of the decisions. How do we connect the participation of the whole people of God with the part of the people of God that are the hierarchy, but not disconnect the hierarchy, feeling them as outside the people of God and just waiting to listen the rest of the faithful and not being part of the listening process that leads to a decision taking in the church. Any decision-making model must take into account that the Theological Commission says the synodal dimension of the church must be expressed through the realization and through the governance of processes of participation and discernment, capable of manifesting the dynamism of communion that inspires all ecclesial decisions. This is, again, a big challenge, how the realization of decisions, how the participation of all of us has to inspire the whole ecclesial life and not part of it. To end, will we be able to conceive a synodal process in which decisions are elaborated among all so that the competent authority, having participated as one of the faithful in all the stages of the process and trusting that the Holy Spirit has spoken through the people of God, ratifies and witnesses these decisions? We believe that this is the spirit that was expressed by Cardinal Grech when he affirmed in one of his speeches that the Synod of Bishops is the point of convergence of the dynamism, and he says, of reciprocal listening in the Holy Spirit. It is not only an event, but a process that involves in synergy the people of God, the College of Bishops, and the Bishop of Rome, each according to his role, in various phases: diocesan, national, continental, universal. So the challenge is how to link all these different phases in regards to the participation of all, understanding that the authority has to be part of the whole process and not at the end of the process in the last assembly in 2023. We are then in facing a big challenge because it implies a new culture in the church where taking advice and where building consensus should be the ordinary way of proceeding in any instance, in any level, any people in the whole church. This implies then that as local churches, we have to embrace this new model through formation. Why seminaries, institutions that form a seminary, future priests or religious or lay people in theology, in pastoral, in ministries, do not embrace this new model, and therefore a reform of the pensa, or what is being taught, a reform of the ways in which we teach, a reform of the people that teach. Do we have women teaching or not? All those elements are part of a new institutional model if we want to be moving towards an effective synodalization of all the church. So the challenge is to rediscern our institutions, what means to be a parish today, a seminary today, a university today, and in that regards, what means to be a diocese, how is the ecclesial life evolving, do we all participate, who do we include in the ecclesial structures, and binding together every phase of the process, from the first participation, from the listening, to the discerning, to the decision-making, to the decision-taking processes in the whole church. So that's why it is a challenge of a conversion, but also a challenge of reform. It is then time to reform in the church through this possibility of living this synodal path. Thank you.
Ďakujem pekne za prednášku. pánovi profesorovi Lucianimu. Teraz je čas na otázky. Máme tu hneď prvú. Pán profesor Luciani, spomínali ste...
In your lecture, you mentioned revision of the Codex of Canon Law. Of course, this is a legal historical process. It happened in 1917, then in 1983. And the question is, how have the atmosphere and the results of the Second Vatican Council been reflected in the canon law of 1983? Thank you.
Can you repeat, please? Yes, please.
The question was about the revision of canon law. It said that the first time it was revised in 1917, then in 1983, you mentioned the revision of canon law. And the question is, what's your view? How did the conclusions of Vatican II, how did the spirit of Vatican II enter into the Code of Canon Law of 1983? What do you think?
Yes, there are, certainly there is a lack of a complete reception of the ecclesiology of the people of God. There in this moment are challenges of how to reform certain canons that will help to embrace a more synodal church, and how to create new ones that will respond to a new institutional model. So we are also in the phase in which we have to revise the canon law and not code, and not simply creating a theology without really effectively affecting the canon law and the practice of the church. For example, we have the pastoral diocesan councils, but because it is not mandatory, many bishops do not implement it. So that's a synodal structure that could be used to bring the whole people of God in that diocese and give advice and build decision with the bishop in order to create an ecclesial life with a synodal style. But because it is not mandatory, we are finding that most bishops, even when they have it, they do not use it as a synodal structure. So those are the challenges in terms of creating bind bonds between the theology of synodality and structures needed to be put in place in order to be effective.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your answer. If there are any other questions, come forward, please? There is one. I would like you to come forward because even people on YouTube are watching. Thank you. I would like to ask. If some elements from the Aparecida document in 2007 or from the Argentinian theology of the people of God, which seem not to have been realized. If you, Professor, when you're studying the documents of Aparecida, if you can see some elements which are still waiting to be realized exactly in this process of synodality.
Yes, thank you.
Ďakujem.
One of the concepts that is most known but less understood is pastoral conversion of Aparecida, because it comes from Santo Domingo, the conference of the Latin American bishops in 1992. And it is not about pastoral models. It is about the institutional reform in order to create a pastoral style and way of proceeding. So the Aparecida conference brought this concept from Santo Domingo, and it is defined as a way of revising authority and power in the church and relationships in the church. So it doesn't speak about a pastoral model. It speaks about the whole church as a church that anything it does, it should be pastoral. So the big question in that concept is, how do we exercise and live our relationships of authority, of power, of decision taking? So Aparecida gave a step forward and introduced the number that I quoted before, saying that in order to be realized, it needed to incorporate the lay people up to the decision-taking process in the church. So this is received and brought by Francis to Evangelii Gaudium. As we know, he embodies throughout his first years of his pontificate the concept of pastoral conversion. But he relates in Evangelii Gaudium pastoral conversion to reform of the church. So he says the reform that needs pastoral conversion. He means the reform goes or uses the concept of pastoral conversion to understand that it needs a conversion in the relationships of power and authority in the church. And then he moves forward to synodal conversion. This path from pastoral to synodal conversion comes when there is a reception in his pontificate of the ecclesiology of the local churches as this was lived in Latin America, and it is lived until today in Latin America. So that practice that is brought from the local churches embodies today a new challenge in his pontificate, because it is very different if we live this in a region and if we translate this ecclesiology to the whole universal church, because then each local church has to learn to be local church, not to be a church that depends from Rome, but to be a Lumen Gentium says it, where the church exists and is real. So I think that Aparecida embraces this ecclesiology. Francis incorporates that in Evangelii Gaudium and then moves forward towards this synodal conversion as we have seen.
Ďakujem pekne. Ďakujem pekne za...
Thank you very much for the reply. We have been advancing in the time, so we want to stick to the program. Professor Luciani, thank you for your lecture. And now I would like to ask the next guest, who is Norbert Schmidt, who is an architect and also one of the editors of the Catholic Review Salve, also the director of the center near Catholic Theological Faculty. He has been involved in changing the looks of a chapel. He's a curator. He has been a curator. He's also been involved in artistic exhibitions in the Church of San Salvador in Prague. So over to you. Nice evening in Košice and good afternoon or morning in America. Thank you for organizing this, which has been speaking about very important questions in the church. So my topic is synodality and liturgical space. When we debate the present liturgical space, we have been coming to the core of how the gathering of Christians who are celebrating the core of faith show or do not show what synodality is. How the understanding of liturgical space influences the celebration and also the influence of Christians among themselves and to the external world. Karl Rahner has summarized the core in the movement of liturgical constitution of Sacrosanctum Concilium, and he has said that we have to overcome the latent danger of magical, superstitious, and hard to understand mechanicism and ritualism. How to overcome the scandal of unfounded gap between the clergy and lay people, and how to renew, deepen, and enliven the concept of the church. As we have a limited space, I have tried to put the topic into 7 points. So the first of all, what is architecture? Architecture seems like everything material around us that a human person has built, and we can enter. But this view is just initial and unsatisfactory, because the art of architecture is especially the art of organizing and ordering the space. A good architecture should always help reinforce the happening, the human meetings for which it is meant. So it's very obvious that even specific architecture is influencing whatever is happening inside, sometimes more and sometimes less, but it doesn't allow everything. Sometimes architecture can even hinder because it's not suitable for every kind of action. What is liturgy? Liturgy is either a gathering of people who are praying, or it's not church. Not only for Romano Guardini is liturgy precisely key for understanding the church. At the liturgy, the church is manifested and it shows its current looks. At liturgy, the church is also created and repeatedly so. Liturgy also has another always reformed critical element in which people are rising up to God, but there is also a movement of the other direction. God is repeatedly coming close and giving himself to people. In God's word, in sacraments, in the gathering of people. Liturgy doesn't really need the architecture, but the liturgy is so powerful that it forms not only an individual, but also the material surrounding. Personal prayer and prayer together are two aspects, two poles of the Christian existence, without which we cannot think of a church. And if we say it in anthropological language, a person is an individuality who lives in a community, and without it, he or she is dying.
It's a space for worshipping, existential contemplation. It's also a doxology. It's a symbol, it's a sign. When talking about the liturgical space, it's not only about the building with no sense. It doesn't only fulfill an aesthetic value. It's about much more. It's a place, a means, where we can form the Christian community. Nowhere else does the Christian faith get such symbolic form as in sacral architecture. Liturgical architects are not the executional means in the ecclesial aesthetic community. Liturgical architects are basing relationships in the church. To be more specific, they help to build these relationships. They create the image of the church to the public, to the society. The second thing is synodality and clericalism. What it really means in theological, biblical, or ecclesiological view, it's already been said by my predecessors. Another remark is needed. If we want to define synodality as a common path of all Christians, in order to help each other and respect each other, the opposite of synodality would be clericalism. But what is clericalism? Pope Francis, as far as I know, has never given us any specific definition. He prefers expressive imagery descriptions that provoke us. There's a quote: "Clericalism is one of the basic problems of the current church." We should definitely say no to any form of clericalism. It's a perversion of the church. It goes against what Jesus has been telling us. It says that shepherd always walks in front of the herd, defining the direction, and everybody who gets away from the herd gets expelled. Such clericalism is dividing and frustrating and overlooking the people of God. There is a difference between pastoral service and pastoral power. It's an abnormal notion of authority in the church and denigrates the dignity of those who are baptized. Clericalism leads, according to Pope Francis, to performative contradiction to what the church should be about. It's dividing the church not into different confessions, but between ordained and not ordained Catholics. This is not what the church should look like in Francis's opinion. Julia Knopf from Erfurt summarizes it in these words: clericalism is an inappropriate, distorting emphasis on the difference that defines ordinance. Clericalism means there is always this suffix ism. It means a certain way of exaggeration. It enhances the difference of ordinance. These are two things, ordained or not ordained. But for our view on the liturgical space, the most important aspect is the exaggeration aspect and restricting the liturgical area or space. According to Joseph Zvierina, there is no either or, but also. Catholicism is very pluralistic, and this applies equally to spatial solutions of liturgies. When it comes to the language part, the word laity, we should avoid completely. I'm not sure if there is a similar problem in English. If in Czech language, if we keep using the word laity, it's a very confusing term. The term laity is very confusing these days. In Czech language, it means, it conveys a very negative, pejorative meaning. A lay person is someone who is not a specialist, someone who just simply doesn't have a clue. That's why I'm convinced that this expression is very confusing, especially if we are trying for synodality. Let's just try to forbid this word for at least some time and prefer other words. Some problems are so encoded in our language that it's actually needed to change the vocabulary to avoid this confusing schematism. Even from the Old Testament, we know that someone assigning names and titles is in the position of power and decides how others are going to perceive this reality. It's not only about words. If we change the vocabulary, we change the perspective as well. Maybe even more important than words is an oversimplifying view or a completely erroneous division into us and them. Clerics versus laity, professionals versus amateurs. The reality of the church is much more colorful and much more multi-layered, as my predecessors have talked about several times. And what influence do these reflections have on our liturgical topic? If a presbytery is reserved strictly to the clerics and a vote is strictly reserved to the laity, we can't expect to make any progress on our path to synodality. I would like to also emphasize that I'm not for novelization of sacred areas. It's also not a solution for everyone to wear gray suits or white tie or with ties. I would just like to say that I see church as a threshold, as a window to the infinite Jerusalem. And we are going to meet our Creator face to face, so we are all equals on this threshold. How deeply this perspective is encoded, I saw myself in the letter that that was sent to us from our clerical official. The most offensive was actually the form of addressing itself. Dear lay people, dear clericals. The more important ones were addressed as the last ones. Since the council and even before that, the entire debate on the organization of sacred space is rather ideologized. We keep hearing the same arguments, and debates leading nowhere repeat themselves. The old liturgy, in comparison to the so-called Novus Ordo, is defined as the only remedy to improve the state of the church. Attempts by John Paul II and Benedict XVI to integrate anti-pluralistic traditionalists and to equalize both rights have led to no results. That's why Pope Francis had to intervene in this issue. Disputes around the form of celebrating liturgies are by no means surprising. The way of celebrating liturgies emphasizes or embodies the image of the church. the question shouldn't be the liturgy itself, but rather finding out what the church is and what it should look like today. Liturgical space often becomes sort of a battlefield of ideologies. In the USA, we can see the open schismat in a symbolic way, which we can see in the notion of the liturgic space. Eucharists tend to turn into a weapon in various cultural battles. We have Trent parishes, Vatican II parishes. We see similar tendencies in our country, in the Czech Republic. Individual ideological attitudes are clearly political. Anti-pluralistic, identitary ultra-Catholics in the USA vote for guess who. In France, they tend to be attracted to the National Front of Marine Le Pen, and in Germany to AfD. What the situation is in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, you can guess yourself. Fear, ideological confusion, and identity panic surely can be considered the right Christian advisors. But back to the architecture. As you can see on internet discussions, if you've ever seen any of them, they are very depressing. It's always the same question, versum populum or ad orientem. And I'm in a position of an architect, I really can say what the best solution is. From our perspective, neither of these orientation necessarily has to have any influence or meaning. If we talk about the realization of the community around the altar or so-called circumstances, in these cases, we could use both models. Versum populum can be understood in a very clerical way, and on the other hand, the organization ad orientem in a very synodal way.
Point 4, paradox of history. Among great paradoxes of the history of Christianity, we can also count even that we don't have a universal model of a liturgical space. We don't have a fixed organization. There are some fixed places of liturgy, but they're different relations, they're different organization, their variability mean that there is this inner freedom of Christian liturgical space. Plurality of forms of liturgical space gives the responsibility into the hands of each new generation of Christians and the difference of their communities. Number 5, richness of images. No form is self-redeeming. Not only there is diversity of the function of the church, but there are also different images, ideas, what the church should be embodying, representing, what exactly it should be serving for. There are 3 ideological, theological images. The first one is an image of God's people. The second one is image of the church as the body of Christ. And the third one is the church as the temple of the Holy Spirit. There we can also involve modern theological, sociological models. For example, of Tomáš Halík, an image of a church as a school, an image of a church as an open communicative network, an image of the church as a patient ecumenical journey. The word synodality is comes from the Greek syn hodos, which directly means the journey together. All the differences can be reduced to 3 basic typical images or spatial schemes that can and have to be combined. There are some advantages to each, but also there are threats that they will be that they will change into a caricature. The first image of the journey or procession can degrade into a bus. The picture of gathering around the table of the Lord can degrade into arena. The newest one, bipolar organization with an empty center and the table of the Lord and the lectern in the different places of the ellipse can degrade into something like a tennis court. So my experience of the 2 decades in which I have been involved in the question of space, liturgy, and art, I would like to summarize like this. When there are new churches built, the space should be left for different liturgical formations, for different liturgical celebrations. We should only petrify the most important things. We should give space to Catholic plurality, especially in this period when we are looking for the dynamic view, dynamic image of the church journeying, of course, in liturgy as well. When we are speaking about reconstruction, we should, on the other hand, listen and use the given historical space to its maximum. And we should not imply any post-consular schemes, but think of the idea of gathering or of the community, not only in the form of versus populum, because that can also be sometimes very clerical. It's not, we are not to be afraid of reconstructions, sometimes even of pulling the part or the church down. Number 6, 5 specific problems and open questions. First question, or first problem, the relation of the ambo and the altar. Their relation should be key for the whole ground plan of the church. What are the options and what do they show? The second problem, a seat of a priest or where to go with him. It's interesting that after the Second Vatican Council, we don't have a problem of where to place the seat of a bishop, but where to place a seat for the main priest, the Mass. And it's not only in the new churches, but also in the reconstructed churches. Should the bishop be secluded from the other, and not the bishop, the priest, should he be secluded from the other believers? Or should he be in some relation to the other seats, the seats of the believers? If so, how does the expression of belonging to the general priestly office of the all faithful be visually and spatially organized? The third problem, concelebration. Although recently it has been considered something new and positive, in the new context, it can be a very questionable thing. because if there is a lot of priests concelebrating with the bishop around the altar, it can also start and reinforce the negative impression of double level of the Catholic Christians. I am not against the concelebration en bloc, but I think it's a good example of how in the world of the symbolic action, each sign can get a different meaning in a different context. And that context is always the decisive one. Problem number 4. If the Mass is the peak of the liturgy of the Church, where are the other forms of liturgy? The Constitution Sacrosanctum Concilium speaks about the liturgy as a climax to which the whole activity of the Church is directed, and it's also the resource from which all its strength is coming out. But the biggest problems of the post-conciliar Catholicism is that in many parishes, almost every liturgical forms besides the Mass have disappeared. The new liturgies like prayer of songs, the liturgy of the word, or all kinds of prayer and meditation have not been really successful, at least not in our region. It looks like everyday Mass has been the most prevalent one. Last problem, how to use the old churches. There are always less and less Christians, and there is still a lot of historical sacred buildings. The primary question is how to use these old buildings. The church is not a museum. Together with the new churches and reconstructions, we should discover the art of their usage and usefulness.
This is a draft made by Rudolf Schwarz from 1936, and it exemplifies what it should be about in creating a new church. Crossed out is a modern church of functionalistic rectangular forms. We are in 1936. Left out is a church in a Gothic style, the more modern, more progressive style when it comes to the liturgic areas. Whereas the one in the forms whose forms are more modern is supposed to repeat the old methods. Under a Gothic roof, it's we are expected to celebrate masses in a more what style? I would like to say that the author of both drafts prefers ad orientem. This draft doesn't want to prefer any specific architectonic style, but it says that the basis of each church is created by the internal quality of liturgic organization, whether it's modernized. It's possible that old-fashioned concepts can be hidden even under the most modern, behind the most modern architecture. Thank you very much. Thank you again for your very interesting talk. Now it's time for discussion in case you have any questions. If you have any questions, you can come closer and ask your question. Go ahead. We will wait. Hi, everybody. I would like to ask Professor Schmidt. He opened the whole diapason of what liturgical area is supposed to mean. Liturgy reflected a historical period, and if synodality is supposed to and can enter into this force, that it transforms the space itself, where do you think in the liturgical area is the biggest embodiment? And isn't it just a way of perceiving this step in history? If we look back, it's an image of something which isn't the case these days. Wasn't it just a step where we moved forward in our faith? Where do you think synodality is supposed to be reflected? In the reorganization of the church or in many other liturgical actions? And in the whole context of history, is it something transforming? Is just an idea? Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. If I understood your question correctly, you gave yourself a response at the same time. It's something that has been prevalent in the entire historic development. If you have a look at the Trent Council, it's more about the desire for communal celebration. The clerics shouldn't be separated. There should be at least some sort of a visual connection. And this should be the aim of the church. When it comes to Gothic churches, it's more radical than the change we could see coming from this Vatican II. Maybe not many people are fully aware of this, but it was very radical. But like I said, I think it's nothing new under the sun. It's something that even the liturgical movement wanted to achieve. In Boiron, in Marialav, they tried ad orientem approach, they tried to participate as much as they could, or people to participate as much as they could, some kind of a movement that is supposed to lead in the same direction, on and on. Big historical discoveries, remembering where the church was supposed to begin. If it started with the English temple or the liturgy of the Jewish, these are all the things that come into place. The liturgical movement, the Second Vatican Council, and moving forward, taking place in this world, we are still on the way. And in the liturgical area, it's very well visible. I don't have a perfect remedy how to do it or a perfect solution. I just wanted to pay attention to the variety of models which we can use. If we enter an old church, I would like to emphasize maybe the courage. It's important not to schematize things. You are supposed to behave differently in the auditorium, in the church. We can organize it in a bipolar environment or in a central environment. And it's also important who is supposed to attend the event, whether it's parishioners, clerics. There are many elements in intervening. The whole architecture is supposed to be leading to. It affects, the architecture affects the way of our behavior. It's always stronger than liturgic schemes that we think would be the best one. You know it yourself. if you stand against, like I said, clericalism, doesn't have its roots in the spatial organization. It's more a reflection. If you had students around you, you would be able to see them around yourself. It's all about the space and organization. By setting up environment, you set up relationships in the church. You take these people on the same way. You're playing the theater play, if I exaggerate it. I can't really tell you one or give you one general remedy. I would like to just emphasize the variety of forms available, the responsibility, the courage to set off on our journey. And if it works, we should stick to it. And we need to realize that the space and the architecture and the art are a powerful means. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question and response. If anybody has any other question, you can come forward. If not, let me please close this conference on the topic of synodality. Let me thank you to all the participants, all of you who are watching the conference online. Thank you very much to all the speakers in the morning session. Mr. Josef Prokes, Mr. Jan Krupa, and all our teachers from the faculty, from the Theological Faculty of Košice. At the same time, I would like to thank you all the speakers in the second block of our conference, to Mr. Tomáš Petráček, to Mr. Massimo FAGGIOLI, Mr. Martin MADAR, Mr. Rafael LUCIANI, and of course, Mr. Norbert SCHMIDT. Thank you very much again. And this entire event is going to be processed in even a better technological way. You will be able to watch it on YouTube, rewatch it again. Thank you very much and take care of yourself. Thank you.